AI is not arriving in a world that is fair. It is arriving in a world where money, education, and power and opportunity are already unevenly shared. And so when you put a powerful new technology into this kind of unequal society, it doesn't fix that inequality. It usually just makes things a lot worse, right? And as prop, our case is just very simple, that AI will increase socioeconomic inequality because the people who already have more money, more skills, more data, and more control are the ones who benefit first and most. So in my speech today, there will be few points of framing, preemptions, 2 points. Number one, on how AI making the labor market more unequal, and number two, AI concentrates resources to those who already have power. So first on framing, right? I think on the first point should be that what do we mean by what do we mean and also how far AI has gone? When we say socioeconomic inequality, we're talking about the gap between people in terms of economic wealth, job security, bargaining power, and access to these kind of opportunities. And we talk about the rise of AI. We're not talking about like some far away future. AI is already in schools, hospitals, offices, banks, everywhere. And so this is already changing how people work, who gets hired, and also who gets promoted, and finally who's making money. And so AI is raising productivity, but also increasing wage inequality, and the gains are being captured mainly by rich countries and big tech firms, right? And we would also like to say that the invention of AI is like no other, right? So you currently think of this like industrialization. So because AI, this thing, like it can think on its own, it can create on its own. And so it can't necessarily help like support humans in creating or support humans in help thinking because it's already doing that on its own. So you can't really refer to previous examples as like an analogy, right? So we would also like to say that this debate is not on can AI do some good things? Of course it can. The real question we think is that who gets the gains and who carries this cost? So this brings me to my winning metric. I think our winning metric here then is that at the end of the rise of AI, does wealth, power, and opportunity become more equally shared or just more concentrated at the top, right? Because even if AI makes society richer overall, we still win this debate if the extra wealth mostly goes to the elites while ordinary people just lose stable jobs, bargaining power, and access to opportunity. All right. So, one point of like preemption, I think what opposition is most likely to say is that, oh, AI helps everyone because it's cheap and widely available, but access to a tool is not the same as an equal benefit from that tool. And so a poor student and a rich student may both have AI, but the rich student also has better tools, better devices, and better internet, private tutoring, and more time to use as well. So the same tools does not create the same outcome. Now moving on to my points. Number one on how I think AI makes the labor market more unequal. Three things to this then is that number one, AI replaces or weakens many routine and middle income jobs, right? Because a lot of stable and lower middle income work depends on routine tasks such as admin work, clerical work, customer support, scheduling, basic research, data entry, etc., etc., right? These are exactly the
One.
kind of jobs that AI can do faster and a lot more cheaply. And that does not always mean full unemployment. I think sometimes this means like fewer workers are needed, and sometimes it means the job becomes less skilled, more monitored, and lower paid. But in either way, the worker becomes easier to replace, right? And this already hits vulnerable groups harder. For example, women are more exposed to like AI because they are overrepresented in clerical and administrative roles and are easier to automate, right? The second layer to this then is that I think AI does not help everyone equally. It often just works best as a multiplier
Why?
for people who already have skills, status, and capital, right? A top lawyer with AI can serve more clients, a top consultant with AI can produce more work, and a top programmer with AI can become even more productive. And so one highly skilled person now have the ability
Point
to
of
be more
information.
efficient because they're able to use AI. And this essentially just creates the effect that the best paid workers become even more valuable, whereas regular people who do clerical work or like are an Uber driver, they can't really use this the same way that like people in more power positions do. And number three, the third layer to this then is I think AI is not just about automation, it is also about surveillance, monitoring, and algorithmic management, right? I think the bosses now can track output a lot more closely, set harsher targets, and also
Point
just
of
essentially
information.
protect workers because of how like AI is there and that people are constantly under the fear that they're getting replaced by AI, the meaning which that these employees now have a lower bargaining power. And I think the impact of this point then is just that the result of all of this is very simple, that higher profits are at the top and that weaker wages and weaker security are at the bottom and the middle. And that means AI does not just create like a few losers. It kind of just hollows out like the entire middle of the society, which is one of the clearest ways inequality grows, right? Before I move on to my second point, I'll take a POI.
Should
Three.
clerical work, yeah. Should clerical work exist if it's productivity impeding?
Can you repeat? I don't really understand.
Should clerical work exist if it's productivity impeding?
Well, clerical work should exist either way because it's the only work available to some middle to lower income people. Because if this work is taken away, then that a bunch of people are going to lose their jobs, and there's no replacement for that because you cannot go on saying that, oh yeah, you can just use AI to learn new skills, or you can transition into new skills because there's a new job market. That is practically impossible because essentially people spend a lifetime learning their skills, and it is very unpractical to just go on and say that, oh, like there will be a new job out there for these people in the job market when they don't even have the skill level for this, right? Now, moving on to my second point about how AI concentrates wealth and the opportunity in the hands of those who already have power. I feel like there's again three layers to this. Is that number one, the biggest gains from AI goes to like most of the owners and not just the users. Because to build and dominate AI, you need massive amounts of data, computing power, infrastructure, etc., right? And who has that? I think it's not ordinary workers, not small businesses, and not poor communities. It is large firms, major platforms, and like very powerful countries. So even if millions of people use AI, the real money kind of just flows upward to people who own this kind of system. And so that means the rise of AI creates like a concentration of wealth towards these stronger, bigger companies and wealthier, like, and more powerful countries. Second layer to this then is that AI compounds pre-existing inequalities in education, business, and geography, right? Because rich schools can train students to use AI well, that rich companies can integrate AI into every department, and that rich countries can build infrastructure to attract this kind of talent. And poor communities cannot do that as easily. That means AI becomes a force of multiplication if you start ahead. And so when you pull even further ahead, essentially like you get like if you start earlier and pull further ahead, you just get more bargaining power. And on the third layer, AI can increasingly use like hiring, lending, insurance, and public services and screening. And so this matters because if those systems are trained on like biased data, they can just reproduce discrimination at scale, which is why I'm proud to propose. Thank you.
The Gov's claim hinges on the point of structural unemployment, which they have not successfully proven. Overall, they completely neglect the improvement of substantive and procedural fairness, which is derived from AI, as well as the creation of new jobs, which will ultimately ensue. Firstly, on setup. Note here, there are a lot of agreements with the ultimate outcome and the meaning of the topic here. What is the topic ultimately about? Ultimately, it's about long-term growth, which will ensue with AI. Secondly, this is probably true because it will decrease socioeconomic inequality in the long run. And if you have effectively done this, you must have already addressed it effectively. So whoever wins this debate is whoever proves the most long-term impacts. Secondly, why is the rise of AI likely to be done well? We give you two reasons for this. Firstly, AI being irresponsibly used is already unbelievably commercially unpopular. Like we give you the example of OpenAI backlash for its military deals. This means that reputation can ultimately lead to the prioritization of fairness, the prioritization of ethicality over profits here. Secondly, on electorally unpopularity, we see that this is manifested in the example of Donald Trump backflipping on his position about AI regulation. And now he is pushing aside of ethicality and regulation, ensuring fairness here. And why do we think this will be done well? We observe that AI can and has been heavily regulated, e.g., every new program before being released to the public has been regulated and checked by numerous parties with oversight from the government. And ultimately, this is important because it will directly respond to the limitation of the job loss claims. Now, onto my first point on creative destruction and productivity growth in the long term, which directly responds to the Gov's claim on structural unemployment and the replacement of middle income jobs. Firstly, why has this been disproven? I'll move on to numerous historical examples, but firstly on the main economic concept here, the concept of Schumpeterian creative destruction. We see that introduction of new technology that replaces human labor has always and will always continue to create new jobs and lead to productivity growth. In the long term, this means living standards improvement, which ultimately reduces socioeconomic inequality. Now, why is this the case? All right, firstly, we see that the creation of new sectors always follows. Why is this? Because there's always an infinite quantity of wants and needs. We see that when a set of wants and needs can be fulfilled, labor can be redirected and retraining can occur, leading to the fulfillment of new wants and needs, which are created as a result of the new productivity which we are able to capitalize on. Ultimately, creative destruction permits the shift of focus. It will not lead to the elimination of jobs completely. There will never be a situation in the economy where there will be billions of people or millions left unemployed simply because it is not productive and simply because there will always be ways to capitalize on human labor. No, thank you. So, what is the outcome of this? The outcome of this is ultimately more productivity growth. Human labor becomes more efficient. Automation removes redundant labor, repetitive labor, which is ultimately not high paying and not beneficial for those people. And this leads to higher output in the long term. And this higher output improves the standards of living for all people. Now, what is the impact of this? We see that an improvement in general standards of living always benefits the lower income deciles the most. It always benefits them the most because they're suffering from the current standard of living crisis, which can always be higher and can always be elevated through increased productivity. But what will AI integration look like? And why does this not look like structural unemployment? Firstly, we see the replacement of manual low-paying jobs, but as stated by side opposition, they claim that the elimination of the middle level jobs will be eradicated completely with no replacement. Now, why is this untrue? Firstly, we see that these jobs generate a lot of inefficiency and the functionality is often not there. Rather, by continuing with these functionally inefficient jobs, it is much more efficient to permit retraining, which ultimately AI will enhance. I'll explain this more later. So ultimately, what we will see in the labor market is not the eradication of all these roles completely, not a bunch of people going to unemployment benefits. We see that this is completely unreasonable. What will actually happen is the shift from such labor to more intellectual work. People will be able to transition from intellectual work. It will be reflected upon throughout the training throughout history. I'll take you in a second, and it will be a lot faster and permitted through AI. Yeah, I'll take you now.
Don't you think that when middle income jobs transform into higher or lower income jobs and polarize to the two powers, wouldn't it make the income gap actually greater? Because it is polarized, as you have said.
We don't think this polarization occurs, right? Firstly, we observe in the current labor market, polarization is extremely intense, and this is because of a lack of fairness, right? Fairness throughout the process, substantive and procedural fairness. If AI can improve the fairness on these aspects, it ultimately reduces polarization. Now, on AI job creation. Firstly, we note here that AI job cuts have not happened at all. They have not manifested. People claim it happens in the tech sector. It has not. The job cuts in these sectors were a result of COVID level bureaucratic problems. Now, what is the current problem with AI and why does it create more jobs? We see that it's because of infrastructure bottlenecks with AI. There's not enough infrastructure. Infrastructure needs to be created. And as a result, more jobs are created to solve the issues which are limiting AI from progressing. Now, we see that this ultimately leads to job creation as a result of AI. We see that a lot more jobs surrounding R&D will be created. R&D, which is highly intellectual and productivity growing, improving socioeconomic outcomes will ultimately follow, and this ultimately leads to the reduction of inequality. Now, we also see the transition of the nature of human work. We see that ultimately humans will be using AI as tools to forward their own capabilities and their own productive labor. We see that from action, they go to a role of supervision. They are utilizing AI tools to improve their own productivity and ultimately increases their value as individuals. So the bottom line here is that job loss is a myth. Revamp in work structures will occur. Higher productivity happens. Better standards of living follow, and lower inequality will come as a result. We give you the example here. We give you numerous examples. We give you the printing press. We give you computers. We give you the telephone. They all removed repetitive and manual labor. We give you sewing machines as well. They ultimately hiding these technology does not lead to the eventual rollout. Rather, the introduction of this technology leads to better adaptation, improvement in productivity, and ultimately improves standards of living across the board, which benefits lower income deciles the most. Now, secondly, on accessibility, mainly addressing side government's claim on the concentration of power. Now, why does accessibility of information grow to an extreme extent? We see that AI is far easier to use than manual search. This is proven. We can see that finding information is often very difficult due to the search capabilities and search limits of individuals. There's often a skill gap for the less informed, and they're not able to access the same degree of information. Therefore, we are improving fairness here. We are improving the equality of access to information, and this ultimately levels the playing field for all people, regardless of income. The outcome of this is easier retraining and knowledge acquisition. This is ultimately what you need to break poverty traps. This is what you need. It's unique on our side. We permit skill accumulation. This allows people to become higher value, and this ultimately leads to the increase of income. This improves equality across the board. This is unique here to our side, unique, and you should weigh this extremely highly because we are the ones giving advantages to those that are in less unfortunate positions where they have limited accessibility. The impact of this is lower socioeconomic inequality being improved and higher procedural and substantive fairness. Another unique point under our side is the benefits for sole traders and operators. AI can provide services that they can use, albeit at a lower quality than human input, but ultimately it levels the playing field here. This means opportunity of access is leveled once again, and entrepreneurship is boosted significantly here. Ultimately, the centralization of power does not occur. Proud to oppose.
If AI makes the society rich overall, the wealth gap is still very big. GDP is still going to be contributed by the elite. The wealth accumulation is still going to go to the top of the society. And therefore, that is the reason why Proposition is so proud to stand on our point. Just three things in this debate. The first is some basic rebuttals. Second, adding on to the characterization alongside. And third, I'll provide one piece of extension on the polarization of AI ownership on a global scale. And I'd like to first begin with a rebuttal of our opponents of a few pieces of main points. Our opponents argue about long run development of AI. They argue about in a long run, AI is going to benefit a society very well. However, they argue as well that AI is generally commercially unpopular. I'd like to ask the opponent, are you self-contradictory? If AI is really that commercially unpopular, how is your long-term development plan going to be working? I think that this is self-contradictory and paradoxical because if AI is really commercially unpopular and in the long run, this unpopularity is continuing, it is impossible that the companies are going to stick to the plan of developing AI to make money, right? So in a monopolistic competition is still going to quit the market. So this is actually self-contradictory and a long-term development would not exist. So we think that AI is actually not commercially unpopular on this point. Our opponents simply missed the point because if AI is really commercially unpopular, our discussion cannot continue in this debate. Secondly speaking, our opponent argues about government limitation in order to mitigate our point on monopolization and labor force polarization. However, our response is government simply cannot intervene to the wealth accumulation of the monopolistically competitive market because the big tech giants on the top of the market are simply making money, right? The intervention is not going to be very, the intervention has no reason to go on. The policy intervention of the government is not going to have the same power as the wealth accumulation generated by the high speed of production by the AI technology. Moving on to the next point, our opponent also talked about creative destruction. They talked about productivity for the whole society and transition of the jobs. This is actually our point, judges, because it is also our point, the transition of middle class, how this works. The middle class jobs, the middle income jobs are going to be separated into two powers. We're not talking about structural unemployment. Our point doesn't have a really on a point on structural unemployment because we think that AI doesn't really necessarily bring unemployment. We are also talking about creating more jobs, but creating more jobs doesn't mean that a wealth gap is going to be smaller. The wealth gap is only going to be larger because what AI creates is elite jobs that has relatively larger income. The incomes of these jobs are going to be largely separated from the middle class group. The middle class groups who has more resources and has relatively more resources to continue to develop in their personal career are going to move to the top. And the middle class people that are worse off in a society, regardless of reason, they're going to move to the lower top. And this is the polarization of the job market. Actually, this is what creates inequality because middle income groups polarize to the two extremes. Also, on our opponent's point about productivity, it doesn't really change the wealth gap, right? Because the overall productivity doesn't mean that the distribution of wealth is fair. It doesn't mean that the lower income group can always be benefited in any cases. The best example is two students with two different family stances, one from a lower income family and one from a larger income family. And the larger income family might have more possibility to get into education in the elite university in the United States, for instance. And the other student could simply stay at home and, for example, go to a community college simply because his families cannot afford such tuition fees. Therefore, when they are both using AI, in their context, they have different kinds of usage. The higher income students could use the AI to generate more useful skills that is going to help him to develop more skills in elite education. However, the context doesn't change for the lower income people. The lower income people can only use AI in a context that is not shaped by the structure of the society. So the accessibility actually does not turn into decreasing disparity in utilization, as my example has already proven. Now moving on to my adding to the characterization. I'd like to solidify the characterization of my first speaker. My first speaker mentioned that a winning criteria in this debate is to discussion on a concentration of wealth. The concentration of wealth on the top is our main point in this debate. The characterization in this debate are, firstly, the market is oligopolistic, meaning that a couple of big companies right now in the market are dominating over the production and development of artificial intelligence. We see OpenAI in the United States. We see DeepSeek and TikTok in China developing all of these AI great generation models and dominating over the market. Small businesses cannot survive because anywhere small businesses simply survive, the larger businesses will tend to buy and purchase these businesses and turn it into part of the oligopolistic market. The second piece of characterization is the wave of middle income jobs vanishing and a rise of new elites, according to the education gap, right? As
Point of
I have
information.
already stated later. And the third one, I'd like to explain, our opponents simply want to rebut all of our point by stating of the past examples of telephones, like phones, like computers. But we think this is not true for three reasons. The first is that we are living in 2026, and the development of AI is largely shaped by the big capitals in 2026 and the 21st century. Back in the past, when iPhone is still developing, there's no such large businesses and large capitals. The scale of capitals today in this century is much bigger today. And the second is that the self-generation tool and self-iteration, the machine learning mechanism of AI is going to make the development more easy. It's going to make the development more faster. And the ones who has, but there is a threshold for the domination and ownership of such technology. It's the wealth gap between nations that are already existing between the companies of different classes of groups. So this is actually intensifying the wealth gap. And the third is that even if you don't buy this, the exponential group and speed of production, which is already extremely high for AI today, is going to intensify the process, is going to make a wealth gap worse, and everything is going to a feedback loop. Moving on to my point, but before that, POI,
Last
please.
chance. Yeah, is radiology a middle income job?
Excuse me?
Is radiology a middle income job?
This is not related to the debate. We're only saying that in the long term, the polarization is going to separate a middle income job. I don't know what your point is. Moving on to the extension, which is far more important than this POI, is the polarization of AI ownership on a global scale. Three premises. Firstly, the ownership of AI technology is dominated by a couple of governments in relatively stronger countries like the USA, China, and Europe. Second, the vast majority of the low-income population and the population in poverty are located in developing countries instead, and other developed countries that has little ability to develop AI technology on their own. The servers are AI take energy, and the programming talents are scarce on these countries. The third is that developing countries are largely reliant on expensive services and trades given by other big nations, according to the asymmetry of power and the price of big tech. So even if our opponents think that AI could be serving some services, we at least have a less impact on this, is that the polarization of AI ownership on a global scale is not going to resolve the moral inequality. So the accessibility to a strategic and premium first-hand tech in AI will be polarized at a point of the big nations. The gap between knowledge accessibility and production will be concentrated in the big countries in the long term to come. Three impacts. The first is geopolitical separation. The second is more jobs on AI created for citizens in big nations, but not in citizens in small nations. And the third is that global monopolization is going to intensify, which adds on to our characterization of this debate. Opposition is letting all of these happen, and therefore we're so proud to propose.
Adjudicator. Side proposition tries to champion the jobs of low SES peoples. However, what they fail to understand is that these very jobs trap these people within cycles of poverty. What we give to you is we allow for people to attain jobs, which upskill them, which train them. We give people the access to information, unilateral information, which allows them to attain these jobs in the first place. They tried to tell you that AI was impossible to use for low SES people, that you needed to be coming from a rich school to be taught how to use AI. We thought that was a completely ridiculous characterization, which sought to demean the people in these sorts of circumstances and try to tell you that these people were never going to escape these cycles of poverty. What we told you was that because we were creating jobs that were actually going to allow people to upskill themselves, to have room to grow, to lift themselves out of poverty, that we were actually going to get significantly better outcomes for all these people in the end. These were the most vulnerable people in this debate. We won this debate. First, three issues in this debate. Firstly, one thing on framing. We have this sort of claim at 2A about the fact that we're telling you that it's contradictory because we're basically saying that it's going to be well run because it is incredibly commercially unpopular to run it poorly, but then it's also like you're still going to have the rise of AI. We thought this was like kind of a weird push that I didn't quite understand. I think the idea is that you basically, the misuse of AI is so incredibly commercially unpopular. We gave you the example of OpenAI having a 200% increase in like uninstalls and like subscription cancellations after they hadn't signed a bad military contract, forcing them to go and review that contract to put in more safeguards. We thought that was a very clear example of how you had to use AI well as like a commercial company. Otherwise, you face huge, massive backlash. We thought that like the opposite, like the contradiction there didn't really exist. it was kind of a weird claim. So two issues in this debate. Firstly, on job creation. Our claim to why we win this issue was that we created more jobs than we lost overall, and that the jobs that we created were more accessible, were the most accessible jobs to low SES peoples. Two claims here. Firstly, what jobs do we think were lost? Prop tries to push that you lose things like clerical jobs, data compiling jobs, for example. But observe something about these jobs. These are bad jobs. There is no room for you to grow. You are not gaining any skills from having these jobs. They keep you in a cycle of poverty where you are living paycheck to paycheck. What we thought about these jobs is that did we have an overabundance of them, which meant that low SES peoples were pretty much forced to go into these jobs in the first place. It meant that you were basically. It means that the jobs that they were going into were basically the jobs that they were
Point.
going to have for a long time, unless they were like shifting from job to job. We understand that we lose these bureaucratic jobs, but observe a second thing. These cover more jobs than just low SES jobs. For example, we have bureaucrats, executives. These are upper class jobs or upper middle class jobs. We thought that these were also people who were going to be targeted. What this does is we tell you all throughout our first speaker, this is a claim that goes largely responded to, is that because we cut so many menial jobs and we have so much more productivity, that we basically just get so many more good outcomes because we have, for example, more construction workers, because that is something that is an industry that grows when you need to build things for AI. We have a bunch of these jobs that basically give people so many opportunities and so many skills to go and learn a trade or to go and become a software developer. These were things at which AI was going to be able to give you access to that. The second thing was on job gain. We told you that the jobs that we replace are not only good but highly accessible to lower SES people. They are better as they are simply upskilling jobs that train you, that give you real skills that allow you to move throughout the industry and grow. They allow you to work. They allow you to basically for your work to actually like for you actually to see like reward and growth for your work, because you basically, the harder you work, the more you learn, you're actually going to be able to do things. Compare that to a clerical job, a data compiling job. The harder you work on a data compiling job, you don't get anywhere. You just sort of compile more data. You don't learn anything. But for example, in a construction job, you work hard. You get an apprenticeship. You go through all the things. You work in construction. You are able to actually upskill and like there are ways in which you can like raise your income, get promotions, for example. The we see huge we see that these are very accessible jobs, which I'll expand in the second issue. This looks like hospitality, where we've already seen huge growth in the recent growth in AI. In the recent rise of AI, we've seen huge growth in hospitality. We've seen huge growth in construction. Op tries to flip this claim by saying that you get like more very like high skill rich jobs that only rich people can get, and then like we have like
Point.
there's like we you basically remove middle. Yeah, actually, I'll take you.
Who's going to get into open AI? A Stanford student
Okay,
or
so
student with
we
no
I'll
ability
get onto this in
to
my
charge
second
an
issue.
Ivy League
Basically, the
tuition?
claim that you're trying to make is that only rich people or very smart people are able to get into open AI, or like these AI companies. Firstly, observe that these are not the only types of jobs in which we tell you get job growth. We told you got a huge growth in construction and hospitality. These were very accessible jobs. But also, we told you that AI was oftentimes going to be the thing that made or break your upskilling potential. I'll get onto this in the second issue. Adjudicator, just the jobs that are cut are not exclusively low-income jobs. You likely get cuts across the board. And job growth occurs pretty much massively for easy access upskilling jobs. On the second issue on accessibility, the claim that accessibility to good jobs, the claim that we made is that low SES peoples get opportunities in which they are able to basically get more equitable distribution of information, more equitable opportunities. What did this look like? We thought it looked like being able to ask AI in like a one centralized place, easy to access place about government programs, scholarships for low SES people, opportunities that you were to access. Even more than that, it looked like being able to access diminish educational inequality because you gain good tutelage. Prop claims that you like benefit the top because like adjudicator, just gut check this. AI is easy to use. It is free. The reason rich people do well in school and have such an advantage in life is because education is expensive. Tutors are expensive. But because AI reduces this gap so much, you can expect for people in the long run to be able to upskill themselves And that was and weighing this debate, even if you thought that we got maybe short term like harms to like low SES people, which we tell you we don't, but you should understand that because we just allow low SES people to upskill themselves with AI, to educate themselves with AI, because we reduce that systemic inequality in education, that was the barrier to people being able to participate in society. That was the thing that was going to get the most long-term outcomes for low SES people, and that was the thing that you should award this debate upon. You should not award this debate based on anything, based on the fact that maybe you get like cuts to like clerical jobs. You should award this debate on the fact that we tell you that the types of jobs that low SES people are now able to get are much, much better. So proud to oppose.
Panel, AI is not the same as whatever technologies we have seen in the past. Our opposition is continuously trying to use analogies to things we have seen, for instance, in the Industrial Revolution, things like computers, telephones, sewing machines, etc. But let me tell you that do not let them carried off by this kind of new kind of logic, because AI is like no technology we've ever seen in the past. Why? Two logic. First of all, instead of helping people do something, it can do things on its own, on programming alone. You need a person to type a computer, you need a person to work a sewing machine, but you do not need a person to push a running cell or to automatically learn new programming ideas, right? And secondly, it increases productivity exponentially, and instead of concentrating on how many times you yourself utilize AI to help you increase your own productivity, it itself can increase productivity exponentially. And this is exactly what set apart from other machines that help you increase productivity, because it compounds productivity. For this gives capitalists more incentive to replace you or other middle income people with AI, because as they claim themselves, AI is free, right? They say, again, sorry, I will take you later. They say their leader of opposition claimed that, quote unquote, there will never be a scenario in the future where billions of people are going to be unemployed. They assume that the future will not get so extreme, but they never gave you any reason to prove why the future will not get so extreme. When we already tell you that there is no, sorry, I will take you after the second minute. But they never gave you any evidence to actually prove why the future, which is something we've never experienced before, will not get so extreme. When we already tell you this is something that we've never seen before, and we also tell you that there will only be incentive for people, for capitalists who are profit driven and companies who are also profit driven, to replace something with high productivity and is free, things that can work 24/7 with people who you have to give wages to, who you have also to, for instance, I will take you after the second minute to for instance to let's say you need to give them wages. You also need to give them, for instance, they have to take 2 days off per week, etc., etc., etc. But third of all, like panel, just let me make this very clear. Even if you buy their analogy of the Industrial Revolution, even if you buy whatever they say that eventually there will be more job opportunities, let me just tell you that income inequality has compounded in the past 100 years, even with the Industrial Revolution, right? So this is directly telling you that even though there will be job opportunities, for instance, created in the short run, in the long run, it's still gonna be, at the end of the day, things that will only increase more social welfare and material advantages for the people who are at the very high, most of the social hierarchy. What is your POI?
Why would a government have the incentive to not regulate this technology if this technology presumably does have the potential to displace millions of people?
All right, so now, again, moving on to like regulations, etc., etc. First of all, your claim is that AI law is already mature and complete, as you've already stated. Now, first of all, this is directly outlandish because there's no uniform law system within the world. The only thing that currently is in place is the EU laws, which will not come into effect until 2027. The second thing is that the purpose of creation does not match the actual implementation. Companies have the incentive, if they know that the government is going to work against them, they're gonna put things under the curtain. They're going to make sure that no one actually knows what they're actually using AI for and how much percentage of the company that AI is actually going to take over. They will have the incentive to hide from companies, and what you're doing is only making things harder for the government to detect and making and pushing on these companies to do things that are kind of even worse for these workers, because the workers will get laid off without even knowing how or why they're going to lay off and which part of the jobs that AI is going to replace. But then moving on to the overall like sector of how our opponents want to win this debate, their major scope is that Okay, in the short run, indeed, there will be some kind of inequality. But in the long run, when we're going to have job training, when we're going to all have those replacements, in the long run, there will be more job opportunities, so therefore everyone can get better. Now, there are several reasons why this does not work. First of all, there is much more at stake than, let's say, 100 years before. Because of globalization, each economic market fluctuation now impacts much more infrastructure, much more capital, and much more labor. Secondly, even if people adapt and learn new skills, companies will not hire them back, adjudicator. Why? Because, first of all, they have many costs. They have shoe leather costs. In order to, like, let's say, replace and have workers back, they also need some material costs. And this is why they have no incentive to start changing and hiring back these workers. And secondly, because there is competition within the AI field, AI companies such as OpenAI also have the incentive to upgrade their AI and make their AI more powerful, so that eventually, when you as a human learn this kind of things, AI will have again much over pursued it and take over you in this new field that you are pursuing, right? And then now moving on to what their only standing claim, which is job training. Several pieces of response against this. First of all, there are thresholds to enter stages of training within a company, right? You have the interview before actually making entry to a company. And secondly, like, let's to be clear, who will value AI credentials over, let's say, MIT or Ivy League credentials, right? Like, as say, I learned this new skill due to AI, right? However, you're competing against people who have graduated from these Ivy League schools, right? The company is also going to hire those people instead of you, who come out from a middle to lower income job and then use AI to re-educate yourself. And then they say AI is free, so you have no startup cost to re-educate yourself. But first of all, there is an opportunity cost, and that is time. And within time itself, AI will also upgrade. And secondly, it's only because AI is free, so the company has more incentive to train AI instead of to pay you wages and train you. And finally, they claim that there will be cuts across the board. There will be cuts within middle to lower income jobs, as well as, for instance, let's say in very high level jobs. This does not help them win this debate, right? Because at the end of the day, the elite people, even if they are cut, because they have originally a lot of credentials and originally a lot of technology, it's easier for them to find replacement for the jobs that they are laid off. They are easier for them to again flourish within the system, because they are the people who control and take advantage of the system. So therefore, finally going to weighing job. Judge, they say that AI law is mature and complete. We tell you that no, because the proportion of creation does not match the actual implementation of creation. They say that some jobs like clerical work will always exist, but in the status quo, it's not a problem of whether they will exist. It's a problem of whether companies choose to allow them to exist if they are profit driven. And finally, they say you have to use AI well, or else there will be public pressure on you. But the ChatGPT versus American military case is simply how people view things such as moral or not. And we believe that in the future, if you value your job over what companies do, at the end of the day, you are still more likely going to stick to AI and not, and that will render all our values correctly. Therefore, never prouder to propose.
At the start of this speech, I want to talk about what wealth inequality actually is. Because yes, Judge, if you do buy that it is nominal dollars, that if elites make tons of more money compared to the average person who is able to then get a job, then yes, you should believe that prop wins this debate. But we on OP do not buy this definition of wealth inequality. We think wealth inequality refers to the living standards of people. This is why even if a relatively wealthy person, even if the CEO of a mass AI company is able to make twice his income in the long run, we think if the average person on scale is able to get a job, then that is a far more equal divider of wealth inequality. We think that is what shrinks wealth inequality when millions of people who are unable to get a job previously, who are then able to get a job on the outside of the house, that's what we think contributes to the lowering of wealth inequality. At the start of this speech, I want to talk about Ops push on how you concentrate wealth amongst elites and just remove that claim. I've already talked about how we think that wealth inequality refers to whether people are able to, whether an average person or the low SES people are actually able to access jobs, because we think and even if elites gain a ton of money, they are already pre-existingly rich, so they maybe have a 50% increase in their wealth. But we think that a family being able to get a job maybe refers to a 200% increase in their wealth. Proportionally, obviously, that lowers the inequality divide. Secondly, AI is extremely accessible. And as we've told you from first and then second, you close the educational gap and you make upskilling far more available. And I want to note the comparative is not just you're able to access information. No, the most vulnerable people in this debate, the people who are racial minorities, the people who are on the bottom of the SES, on the bottom of the SES pyramid, who are unable to access good schooling. Because the truth is that many schools are underfunded. These people don't have the resources to upskill themselves, to actually access a good education, and AI radically closes that gap. It makes jobs so much more attainable. Okay, two issues then in their speech. Firstly on jobs, and secondly on accessibility. On jobs, proposition has two main claims here. They talk about job displacement and job polarization. On job displacement, a few responses. AI is extremely unpopular. Firstly, because empirically AI is unpopular. If you look at the current poll ratings of AI, you'd find that the majority of people living in America actively despise AI because they fear that it will replace their jobs. Therefore, the government has a huge incentive to regulate how corporations can use AI. For instance, to stop forcible displacement of people on jobs, to regulate the worst harms of AI.
Point.
Surveillance. No, thank you. And Proposition's only response to this is to say that this law is not mature, but we think that the law is not currently mature. We never claimed that it was. But the fact that governments now have incentive to regulate AI, given that it's a relatively new thing, means that in the future it's extremely likely that around the world governments will collectively regulate AI to ensure that job displacement is lowered. But they also talk about how it's hard to enforce this. But no, we think that you can enforce measures such as transparency, such as disclosure requirements that mean that corporations have to act ethically. Secondly, firms often self-regulate and try to limit job displacement. Why? Firstly, it often appears terrible when a firm is seen as displacing workers. For instance, the media portrays them as destroying livelihoods, which makes them look extremely unethical. Look at ChatGPT, where boycotts are literally led to the Quit GPT movement, which harmed their revenues. But secondly, AI companies often have their own internal regulations, and they often have their own degree of consciousness. Look at Anthropic as an example of a relatively ethical AI company. The point of this is not to say that there's a contradiction within our case. No, we still concede that some workers get displaced. The point is that AI companies self-regulate, and that mitigates the worst harms of AI companies, for instance, forcible displacement. But thirdly, many jobs are simply in labor shortage and will continue to be. And that's the reason that many jobs are currently undesirable and people don't see it as something worth doing. But we think that many of these jobs will still
Why?
and persist. I'll take you in a moment because they have human interaction. Often, what is needed in jobs is the degree of human interaction. We give you the example of teachers or maybe trade jobs where you specifically need humans to be able to perform those jobs. These jobs will become accessible. They'll become in more demand. People will transition to them. I'll take you now.
So when you say that labor jobs are under desire, does that mean that people would rather stay homeless and poor rather than have a job?
No, the point is that these jobs are currently in shortage. So when you displace the amount of jobs, people always have somewhere else to go, which mitigates your claim on job displacement. Second claim then, job polarization. Two responses. Firstly, we think this is simply untrue. There's no very little mechanization given as to why a spectrum of jobs still can't exist. It's very much asserted. We think that the low skill jobs still look like proofreading. Maybe the mid-level skill jobs look like designing prompts, and the high skill jobs maybe look like being an AI lawyer. This spectrum still very much exists as it always has. Secondly, the distribution of jobs shifts to construction, to proofreading, and to other jobs that are very much accessible because there's a ton of material that's generated by AI. So naturally, the very accessible jobs are made more in
Point.
demand. Are made more in demand and more in supply. No, thank you. But even if we accept that job polarization is true, we think that rich people's wealth often trickles down to the average person via government tax, which further mitigates their claim. What do we tell you on jobs? We have two claims here. Firstly, new technology always creates new jobs, and opposition says this is not analogous, but we think it is. Instances like the printing press, instances like the Industrial Revolution, they have all replaced jobs. They have made some such skills outdated, but in the end, they've always created new jobs. I'll give you four examples of what these new jobs could look like. You have new construction workers to construct these data centers. You have new people to review AI output. You have more creative material, which creates demand for AI lawyers. You have more AI prompt designers. You have more AI ethics committees, and et cetera, which proves that there will be more jobs generated by the AI boom. Secondly, AI will inevitably accelerate productivity, and proposition concedes them themselves because it will automate previously inefficient jobs. And the resulting growth is actually what gives corporations more revenue. This is what encourages things like business expansion and growing the corporations, which necessitates more demand for jobs because corporations need labor to grow. why should you weigh this the highest in this debate? Firstly, on vulnerability, these are the most low SES people. These are the poorest people. You benefit them the most. Secondly, on scale, there are millions of these people compared to rich CEOs. But thirdly, this is the most intense benefit. Insofar as a person who was previously unemployed is now able to get employed, that was the most visceral benefit that lowered job inequality. Second issue on accessibility. AI increases accessibility of information. We give you two reasons for this. Firstly, you simply have more information in one place, which can be made highly condensed and highly readable. But secondly, you also increase reskilling because people can now learn new skills and gain new information. And I want to note that the comparative is that you have underfunded education systems, which have throughout history been unable to cater for and lower the inequality gap. AI makes information radically more accessible. It makes upskilling possible for the very disadvantaged in society. That is what lowers the AI inequality gap. Don't buy propositions rhetoric.
Adjudicator, ask yourself how Proposition wins this debate. It's through proving two things. Firstly, they had to prove that government and AI companies were not accountable. Why didn't they reach their burden here? Firstly, observe that the monetary incentive of companies works against them. How? Adjudicator, an analysis at first has gone unresponded to. Reputation precedes income. You cannot make money as a company if people hate you and hate your product. This was always going to make this fall out of the debate. We gave you an example of OpenAI being boycotted. They forced them to revise their contract, which forced them to be more responsible. We give you the example of Claude and Anthropic, who are very responsible AI companies, which have seen much more monetary success because of their because they've been more ethical. People tend to want to do things which are more ethical. For example, they boycott products from countries which commit war crimes. For example, they boycott Olympic Games in countries that do horrible things. The same goes for corporations. Secondly, when they say that the law when they say that our claim is that the law is already mature enough, they have lied to your face. Our claim is that the rise of AI directly correlates to pressure on governments to further regulate it. Their claims about obviously back in the day when AI was a new thing, it didn't have much regulation because it couldn't do much. As time has gone on, it's become more and more regulated as people perceive it as more of a threat, as people perceive it as maybe it can have some job displacement. They give you the example of the EU laws which are going to come into effect in 2027. We think that you see far more of those sorts of things as time goes on, as the rise of AI continues to happen. Because let's face it, the rise of AI hasn't really occurred in full force yet. We think that when you have we think that when you have the United States, you have Donald Trump going and backflipping on his position from AI, going from, oh, we're going to ban all regulation AI to we're going to crack down on companies and make sure we vet every single program that they release to the public. We thought that that was a very good example of how you had that. We also think that we also thought it was because because they sort of underrepresent how accountable powerful entities are. We think you have things like voting, like boycotts, or if it is bad, as they say, revolution. The second thing that they had to prove is that if AI was bad, which he has successfully disproved, that it led to job displacement. Firstly, why do they fail their burden here? Firstly, that not all of this relies on the bad implementation, and all down the bench, and just now we've told you why that was wrong. The second thing here is observe that this is a very short-term claim. We would weigh this out on long-term growth and upskilling for low SES peoples because of the fact that the job displacement, which they say occurs for people who occurs within jobs which are incredibly bad. Essentially, they trap people in cycles of poverty. They had very menial pencil pusher jobs, things like that. That is what we actually lose in this debate. That is all AI will really be used for. Obviously, we tell you that AI regulation will help with that. So we weigh that on long-term growth. So how do we end up winning this debate? We proved to you two things to win this debate. Firstly, that we created good jobs. That was to say that even if we lost out on total job growth, which we told you we didn't, we still created jobs which were basically gave people the ability to upskill, gave people the ability to grow in their lives, gave people better paychecks, gave people better standards of living. Secondly, we told you that we gave people more access to these things, which meant that the most vulnerable people in society now had methods on which they could upskill themselves to get to these jobs that looked like using AI for education. We told you that the most systemic barrier in society was education, and that because we broke that down, we should automatically win this debate on just that alone. That went largely on responded to throughout this whole debate. And the last thing we told you is that we also just get broadly a lot more productivity. We get a lot more done. We get a lot more construction, which we get a lot more construction workers, which means we get a lot more housing. We get a lot more hospitality workers, which means we get a lot cheaper medicine. That was something that we told you occurred. Those three reasons why we win this debate. Thank you so much.
Our opponent must be very bad at a subject of economics because they simply misdefine the socioeconomic inequality. Let's go back to the info slide, guys. The info slide of this very motion. Social economic inequality is normally measured through differences in income, wealth, and living standards. It is not income, wealth, and living standard. It's the differences of them. So therefore, according to the basic measure and definition in a subject of economics, wealth distribution according to the Lawrence curve, is what we are discussing today. So our opponent simply misunderstands this whole motion, and therefore we're so proud to propose. Just 3 things in my speech: call outs to some factual issues on opposition, since this is a fact debate. Second, materials brought back, the most important impact scale comparison, and a worst case, best case scenarios comparison. Firstly, I'd like to call out to the 3 factual issues on opposition that they are facing, and which are irresolvable. The first one is that opposition cannot change the already existing structure of financial ability and inequality between individuals with mere artificial intelligence intervention. Who gets access to the jobs before they even get trained? The Stanford graduate with a diploma from the Ivy League school, or a student who cannot even pay for the tuition fee to elite universities and simply tell the OpenAI interviewees that I learned every one of the skills from artificial intelligence. Of course, the Stanford graduate is going to get into the office even before they even get trained by these jobs. So our opponent's long-term development plan is mere a bubble that will be destroyed as long-term to come, as AI is actually only a tool, but not a diploma or standard of judging a person. Secondly, they cannot change the oligopoly and monopolistic market structure of artificial intelligence because government has little control over the industries. We have 3 reasons. The first is that legislation is not mature, as our third speaker has already told you. And the second is that there are few reasons to regulate them in a capitalistic society for the governments because they're just making money. They have done nothing wrong at the side of the government. But thirdly, even if you don't buy this, I believe that artificial intelligence tech giants are great taxpayers and national income contributors, but does not mean that a government should really regulate them because government don't really have the incentive to regulate them in a trade-off between the problem and the income contribution. However, even if these tech giants can contribute to a lot of the national wealth of this country, they cannot solve the inequality and the differences between the wealth distribution. And therefore, the third factual is that our opponents are allowing polarization to happen, whether in a job market or the international relations, which will bring me to the materials brought back. Opposition's most important material here is they believe that jobs are more accessible. Firstly, this is based on the wrong definition. Second, job accessible. What is important is not how many jobs you can create. What is important is what kind of jobs you create. Their example is AI lawyer. AI lawyer is exactly the job we were talking about. They pay very well, but who gets access to these jobs? The one good educator, right? But an education inequality is irresolvable merely through the intervention of AI. But secondly, proposition tells you that monopolization in AI market, this nature is the basis of everything we're arguing about. But opposition didn't really rebut this. They simply accept the truth that this market is monopolized, and they accept the truth that this monopolization is intensifying the feedback loop within the whole process. But secondly, job creation will actually drive inequality worse, as we mechanize that we create jobs that are inaccessible for the individuals already in a lower class and are paid very well, which means that the accessible individuals who are already in a higher class could be paid better, which means that the inequality between individuals are intensified and the wealth and income gap is already getting bigger and tear down. And the third piece of material is that wealth accumulation is still going to the top because of the monopolistic nature of the market, and our opponents simply didn't respond to that. Our skill is on a global scale, while our opponent's skill is on individual. Even that social impact is very limited. Let's compare the worst case and best case scenarios. Opposition believes that in the best case, new jobs are created, but AI elites are turning into the new higher class. However, proposition's world sees a world where distribution of wealth is arrangeable and manageable. Our opponents simply misunderstand the intention of this debate, and therefore we're so proud to propose.